Dysgu Cymraeg ond tipyn bach. There we are. That means I'm learning Welsh, but only a little. So forgive my pronunciation as we go through. I will do my best. This paper looks at the pioneer women preachers of Welsh Methodism, but sadly, there are not too many of them. So we will be discussing a very select group of women who managed to claim an extraordinary call. One of the first things that often needs to be mentioned when discussing Welsh Methodism in England is that it was Calvinistic Methodism, which was the dominant force in Wales rather than Wesleyan Methodism. By the time of the 1851 religious census, Reformist worshippers together outnumbered Anglican worshippers in Wales. The ranking order was Calvinistic Methodists, Congregationalists, Baptists, and Wesleyan Methodists, the big four of Welsh nonconformity. The Wesleyan Methodists gained a large following during the 19th century, but in the 18th century, it was the Calvinistic branch which led the way. Now, the evangelical revival in Wales is usually said to have started around 1735, because it was to that year that the two main leaders, Daniel Rowland and Howell Harris, dated their conversion experience. They then began organising their followers into societies, largely in South Wales, within the Diocese of St David's. And here we have, you can see St David's there, which was the largest of the four Welsh dioceses, and it was one of the poorest. It covered much of mid and southwest Wales. Now, it was very much a South Walian movement until around the 1780s, when there was a real growth as well in North Wales. Within the space of a century, the evangelical revival transformed religious alliances in Wales to a far greater degree than it did in England, making a substantial impact on society and culture as well. The great historian of Welsh religion, Glanmor Williams, consistently argued from the 1960s to the 1990s that the Protestant Reformation came of age in Wales during the 18th century. It's difficult not to agree with that assessment, as the growth of literacy through the medium of Welsh and the development of a homegrown brand of the Protestant faith led to a more wholehearted acceptance of Protestantism than it had previously. The growth of Calvinistic Methodism in Wales meant that the movement's attitude towards women was increasingly influential in terms of religion and society more generally. It has to be said that attitude to women preachers in Wales was rather more conservative than in England. Women were allowed to pray in societies, but there were doubts about any more public role. The perceived need for an extraordinary call to justify women's activity was the same in Wales as in England. Of course, the same concept of a call to preach, in fact, justified all the Methodist lay preachers, who were normally referred to as exhorters, and who were said to exhort or discourse rather than to preach. There was a particular need to tread carefully because one of the main leaders, Howell Harris, remained a layman and had actually been refused ordination in the church because of his Methodist activities, which were regarded as highly irregular by the Bishop of St David's. Care was taken over terminology in order to avoid seeming to encroach on the jurisdiction of the church and its ordained ministers. caution was certainly exercised over the role allowed to women. On a visit to London in 1743, when Harris was breakfasting with the Whitfield household, a disagreement arose with George and Elizabeth Whitfield, who tended to favour the idea of women preaching, while Harris was opposed. This is a little surprising, since at that point he had already given permission to one woman to speak in her local society. Now, this woman was Elizabeth Thomas of Blindporth, near Aberporth in South Cardiganshire. And there we have a map showing the location, which I'm just looking for. Yes, there we go. There we go. We've got Blindporth. Yes, you can see it. Just inland of Aberporth and north of Cardigan. And on the slide, I think you can see the location of Cwmhoney in quite steep wooded valley between Blindporth and the sea at Aberporth. Now, Cwmhoney means Valley of the Honey, and this river runs into the sea at Aberporth. Erin is showing the map here because Cwmhoney is quite a typical sort of location for early Welsh societies, which often met. Have we got an? I'm just checking. It's the next slide. That's why. Yes, that was confusing me. Right. I'm sorry about that. There you can see the location. Quite typical of early Welsh societies, which often met in such slightly remote farmhouses outside villages, but close enough to centres of population to gather members together. Now, Harris visited the society there on the 29th of April 1741, staying the night at Cwmhoney, the farmhouse where the local society regularly met. He recorded in his diary that night, "I find some do meet, but ye men, being not gifted, a poor, humble, experienced, loving, broken soul of a woman is stirred up to speak a little, and finds great effect, and had scruples on her mind about it. I said, she may, I thought, when ye Lord gave her power, love, and success, discourse a little in a society private, till ye Lord should send somebody fitter. I could not discourage her when I saw her spirit." So it was a partial and temporary approval, discourse a little, till ye Lord should send somebody fitter. But approval nonetheless, and on the basis of her spirit or her call. It's also stated that she had a great effect, despite her own scruples. But it is significant that she was confined to the private society. There was a very clear distinction drawn between private and public roles in the movement, with some exhorters only allowed to speak in the societies, their talents being judged not suited to more public preaching. A woman discoursing in a private society would not draw attention, so this avoided any major controversy. However, it looks as if this really did turn out to be a temporary measure. Elizabeth Thomas was allowed to speak in 1741, but by the early months of 1743, the association had been set up to oversee the activities of the exhorters, as Howell Harris explained, to prevent confusion, and lest wicked persons should go out in our names and do mischief. In the first few years of the revival, a number of individuals began to take on roles as lay preachers. But once the association was set up, there was a rigorous system to make sure that only approved candidates were allowed to speak at Methodist meetings. Part of the rationale was a desire to make sure that nobody spoke out of turn or acted in a way which brought the movement into disrepute. Now, it may well be that giving official sanction to a woman preacher would have been considered too controversial, since the list of approved exhorters does not include Elizabeth Thomas or any other woman. With the development of stricter organisation, it looks as if she was sidelined. This actually may not just have been because she was a woman, but possibly because of some of her opinions, which she expressed in very forthright terms in a letter to Harris in June 1742. This is a remarkable letter in many ways. Coming from that area of South Cardiganshire, her first language would have been Welsh, but she wrote in articulate English. Now, it was common practice for the more educated sections of Welsh society in the 18th century to correspond in English. Elizabeth Thomas was following this trend and giving an indication of her status by doing so. The society in Blaenporth met in Cwmhoney, a farmhouse owned by Jenkin Lewis, who actually lived in Fareham in Hampshire, but also owned property in London and Westminster, so it seems he was likely to have been quite wealthy. In his will, drawn up in 1741, he left his property in Blaenporth to his niece, Elizabeth Thomas, daughter of Thomas Griffiths. And there you've got an example of the traditional Welsh practice of using the father's first name as the second name. A lot of middle-ranking families were following the English trend and adopting fixed surnames instead at around this time. So a lot of sons of John and William became Joneses and Williamses. But this family had yet to do so. The fact that her uncle lived in England and that her mother's family seemed to have been rather well off may account for Elizabeth's level of education and her self-confidence. Harris may have found some aspects of her letter quite alarming, since she outlined her misgivings about some of the clergy. Here we go. Anybody that has an eye of faith may easily perceive without any presumption that they was never called by Christ to preach the word, nor ministering the sacraments, for they never knew anything of the work of the Spirit of God in their own hearts. They never was gifted, fitted, nor owned of God to convert any of their sins, neither did the Lord reveal to them any of his hidden mysteries, or fitted them to go in and out before his people. Neither had they any hand in this great work. And are these now fit to minister the sacraments to the children of God, or his own servants, whom he has owned to be his instruments, to convert, to build up his children in the faith? She didn't pull any punches, did she? She went on to say that she hoped to have the sacrament administered in their society, not by herself, but by one of the exhorters, arguing, why should we not have the liberty of conscience, seeing the government allows it? Now, Elizabeth wasn't the only Methodist to argue in this way, but such arguments for dissenting from the church were consistently opposed by the 18th century leaders, even though a number of the exhorters argued in favour of being able to provide a full ministry to the societies. But these were not opinions that were likely to please Harris. Elizabeth then vanished from Methodist history to all intents and purposes. She does appear in some 19th century accounts of the early movement, but often anonymously. Not in her own right, and certainly not as a preacher, but as the wife of Morgan Hughes. Now, he is mentioned as the first superintendent appointed by the association to oversee the societies in North Cardiganshire. And a number of histories explain that he married the heiress of Cumhony, who's seldom even named. Now, Hughes suffered a good deal of persecution for his Methodist activities, culminating in being arrested and put on trial in Cardigan in 1743 for unlawful assembly. The case was thrown out when the prosecutor failed to appear on the day. And after a good deal of lobbying by the Methodists in support of Hughes, including through the influence of Marmaduke Gwynn of Garth, Breconshire, the future, some of you know, the future father-in-law of Charles Wesley. Now, Gwynn was on the list of JPs for Cardiganshire, and his nephew was the Attorney General in the South West Wales Circuit. So he had considerable influence, which helped protect Methodists in the face of the law. Despite that, Morgan Hughes gave up his role as a Methodist exhorter soon after, and he went on to marry Elizabeth Thomas, and he settled down in Cumhony, joining the dissenters. And it would not be too surprising if Elizabeth also headed in that direction. Yet Cumhony remained the home of the local society and an important centre for local Methodists for years to come. So the couple obviously retained a close relationship with the revival. Morgan continued to preach, but there's no further mention of Elizabeth as a preacher. She was obviously gifted, well educated, and quite formidable. But even she was unable to continue to exhort in the movement once the rules of the association were imposed. As has been noted many times, doors which opened for women could also close when more strict organisation was adopted. It may also potentially have been easier for an unmarried woman who did not have to take into account her husband's views. Now, the next woman preacher we know about is Jane Owens from Dolgellau in North Wales. There may well have been others who just don't appear in the documentary evidence, since they were unlikely to be accepted as approved official exhorters. We know of Jane Owens because she wrote to Howell Harris in 1770. Now, she was a school teacher and seamstress in the area who also preached in the local societies. Again, there's no suggestion of a more controversial public role, but even this seemed to cause an angry reaction locally. In 1770, Methodism was still eyed with suspicion in the north. It wasn't necessarily quite as bad as the 1740s, when Howell Harris felt that before going north of Aberystwyth, it was best to write his will. It's not that different today. No, he did have cause for his gloomy attitude, having been forced to run for his life out of the town of Achuntlith, pursued at gunpoint by one very angry gentleman. Feelings didn't run quite so high by 1770, but even so, comparisons were still made with the 17th century Puritans who turned the world upside down and executed a king who was descended, of course, from the Tudor family and thus of Welsh blood. North Walians referred to Methodists as Roundheads and carrier dogs after Walter Craddock, the highly influential Welsh Puritan who had spent a year in the north, in Wrexham, in the 1630s, and whose dangerous influence had clearly not been forgotten. Jane Owens' letter testifies to the continued opposition in the north. "This is a terrible place against goodness," she announced. Society meetings would be drowned out by shouting from the outside and ferocious knocking at the door. Jane felt that she was being preserved by Providence from the worst of the hostility. People threw stones and spat at her as she went by, but invariably missed their target. Jane wrote to Harris about her uncertainty about how to proceed. The fact that she couldn't afford to give up her livelihood as a teacher, but it prevented her from going around in a way that she felt would be a benefit to them and me. That's what she says. "And yet, I have no means nor anything to live on but that. And if I believed from the heart, I think that God would not allow me to be without anything that was necessary for my maintenance in this life. I believe that the Lord has some work for me to do, that I should not stop. And there is nothing established in my thoughts in this. I hope that you will consult God for him to lay me on the path most chosen by him. I am waiting on the voice of the Almighty to place me as would be most beneficial for him. I am trying to help some people as far as I can by the help of God, without which I can do nothing." One can hear some echoes here of Elizabeth Thomas's having scruples despite her preaching to great effect, probably because of the very fact that she was a woman. I'm translating Jane's words here because the letter was written in Welsh, suggesting that Jane wasn't of the same social status as Elizabeth Thomas. She may well have been one of the many women, men and children educated through the circulating schools set up by Griffith-Jones from the 1730s to the 1770s, where the emphasis was on learning to read the Bible in Welsh. Certainly, a number of the women who learnt to read and write in those schools went on to teach in them later. And it has to be said that the religious motivation behind the charity schools was beneficial to women, since it meant that it was considered just as important to save their souls and teach them to read. Education otherwise tended to favour boys, who were seen as having a more prominent role in society. The Sunday schools in the 19th century would make a similar contribution to women's education. Jane is the source of the quote in the title of this paper, Pregethreg o'i fi. Pregethreg is the colloquial form of Pregethreg, or preacher woman. However, she doesn't absolutely claim to be a preacher. Instead, what she says is, that is what others call her. It's interesting to turn to what she says about this. There are many places around here where no exhorter is tolerated, and they accept advice better from a woman because she does not have the call to exhort. And yet they say, I am a preacher woman, but not everyone who is far away from me believes that. So, they say, as they often do. She thus distances herself from the claim to some extent. Now, I don't want to confuse you completely at this point with a lecture on Welsh grammar, but just to explain this statement a bit further, it is important to know Welsh is a very gendered language. All nouns are either masculine or feminine, and there's no such thing as it. As you might expect, a lot of the terms for professions and occupations have traditionally been masculine. Amongst them was the word for preacher, Pregethreg, or preaching man. There we go. It's the same sort of situation as chairman and fireman in English, where more neutral endings or versions have been required more recently. There actually is still no gender-neutral term for preacher in Welsh. Back in 1770, Jane Owens didn't use the word Pregethreg, since that's the masculine word, but instead Pregethreg. I've not managed to find an earlier example of the use of this feminine form, Pregethreg, and the University of Wales Dictionary doesn't provide one. So this is potentially the first usage and quite a significant milestone, although some further research is needed into this. But these two women are the only known examples of women preaching at any level during the early years of the revival. However, there were perhaps other ways for women to show activism. They were, of course, expected to participate in the societies in the same way as men, which gave the opportunity to be heard in a semi-public setting. They're often mentioned in a somewhat stereotypical way as having provided hospitality for preachers and for those attending various meetings. There was a more informal, often domestic influence exercised by a number of Methodist women, especially perhaps those who belonged to the fairly wealthy farming families who played host to society and association meetings. Catherine Pugh, for example, of Morverbach farmhouse outside Kidwelly, organised exhorters for the local society and provided food and accommodation for a flow of Methodist visitors. She attended meetings at the nearby Chapel of Ease, Capel Ifan, which was widely used by the Methodists. She played an important role in making sure that local arrangements were in place. And it's easy to overlook the level of organisation that was needed to ensure the meetings went smoothly and that food and beds were provided for visiting preachers. In the years before the chapels were built, the movement relied on the support of a number of families of middling rank who had sufficiently large farmhouses to offer as venues for their meetings. Here we see Pantycelyn, the home of William Williams, which was fairly typical of a substantial 18th century farmhouse. Sometimes they might well have been uncomfortably full. When Harris was preaching in a loft in Talley, one of the beams collapsed under the weight of the assembled congregation, just as they were finishing singing a hymn. After dusting themselves down and finding that no one was injured, Harris went on to preach in the midst of the rubble, in the firm belief that Providence had reached out its hand to protect them. However, it is something of a stereotype to resort to the theme of women as the providers of food, and there were other, more spiritual outlets. And one of them was hymn writing, which could be a means of conveying religious truths in memorable fashion, which might have a longer lasting effect than a single sermon. A number of Methodists talked of singing a particular hymn to inspire them in particular circumstances or to express a particular sentiment. Most of the well-known Methodist hymn writers in the 18th century were male, but with the notable exception of Anne Griffiths from Dylannog in rural Montgomeryshire in mid-Wales. Now, Anne Griffiths died at the age of 29 after giving birth to a daughter who also died. Her early death meant that actually only 30 verses of her work survives. But some of them have been sung countless times and have had a substantial impact. There were less heralded female hymn writers, most of whose work has been lost. Very often, the work only survives if it was recorded by a male mentor of some sort. We have one hymn written by Dorothy Jones of Llanllarog in Carmarthenshire, for instance, because the local exhorter, Richard Tibbott, committed it to memory and wrote it in his diary. Wait, girl, oh wait, wait, my beloved. I will come to pull you out from the rule of hateful sin. I am the sun who frees you. Oh, wait, wait for me. I will love you with free love to make you forget your father's house. Now, it's not the greatest work of Welsh literature, but what is striking is that it's obviously written from a woman's perspective. Tibbott occasionally noted hearing Dorothy, or Doughty, which was the usual Welsh abbreviation for Dorothy, and the other girls in the society singing until the early hours of the morning. And she may well have written verses which suited the women of the society most especially. Now, letter writing could also be an active engagement with faith. There were a number of women who wrote to Howell Harris, having met him during one of his preaching tours and been emboldened to contact him as a result. And these letters often provide some sort of conversion narrative and an account of their spiritual experiences. Molly Williams of Irwood in Breconshire was the sister and sister-in-law of two Methodist exhorters, but she confessed that she was too shy to speak to Harris in person. She felt braver about putting her words down on paper in a letter. Mary Giles of Caerleon, near Newport in South Wales, wrote to Harris for the first time in 1740 to update him on her spiritual progress since they met in Caerleon. Since hearing Harris speak, she felt like an owl in the desert, till I became as alien to my mother's children. For when they seed me, the one would sing and another would laugh, but I could do nothing but cry, woe is me, for I am undone. For one time I would think that the earth was ready to swallow me up, and another time I would think if I would cry to death that I should never be pardoned. Now, there are obvious biblical influences here, which show how women could relate their personal experiences to passages in the Bible. One of the best examples of this is the surviving correspondence of Anne Griffiths, the hymn writer, who had an obvious depth of scriptural knowledge, which she applied in her letters as well as in her hymns, and one suspects in her daily conversation. Apart from her, one of the letters that perhaps comes closest to a sermon is that written by Anne Harry to John Belcher, the exhorter who had oversight of a group of societies in the southeast. She wrote from the New Inn in Monmouthshire and seems to have been one of the Methodists under his care. The address she gives refers to a schoolhouse, suggesting that she may have been a teacher which is not unlikely given her confidence in writing. Letters like this usually found their way into the Pregethreg collection because they'd been passed on as worthy of further reading. Those which gave a valuable account of spiritual experience and might be a blessing to others. And it's possible to see why Anne Harry's letter might have been passed on for Harris and perhaps others to read. There are two parts to the letter, and it's only in the second part that Anne comes to the more practical, everyday issues. The first part is full of Anne's hopes for the progress of the revival, expressed in a lively language with vivid imagery. She wrote in very fluent, quite colloquial Welsh, very much influenced by the Bible, so it's tricky to translate in a way that completely conveys the original. But she says that she hopes that John Belcher will be like a spiritual fowler, with one eye on the world and the other eye levelling along the middle of the scriptural road through to the spiritual mark, which is Christ. She expects him to be in the middle of God's barn, threshing his corn with the great flail in your hand, striking out the brains of the hypocrites, the knowledge which is in the head alone. She has some quite conventional phrases about the fire of the gospel and the Lamb of God. But what of the idea of throwing the water of God's grace to cool the pollution which boils in the cauldron of the hearts of sinners? And what of hanging the devil by his heels, with the young men gripping him by the waist, and the grandfathers grasping his head and wringing his neck? At times, she takes a familiar scriptural image and presents it in a different way, such as the idea of the old man being replaced by the new. She extends this by describing the old man physically aging, his tongue beginning to thicken, and the new man speaking more and more clearly and walking more and more agilely, and the old man with his arthritic hips losing his strength. It's a very vivid picture of the old man literally deteriorating while the new man replaces him with his youth and energy. I don't think there's any doubt that this woman could have preached a sermon, but there's no evidence that she did so. But perhaps the society discussions and the opportunity to write letters like this may have provided her with an outlet to express her faith and to communicate her thoughts. There were several women who were capable of analysing spiritual experiences and expressing themselves with reason and force. But despite this, very few women preachers emerged in the 19th century, and the word Pregethreg remains rare into the 19th century. Searches of sources, such as Welsh newspapers online, Welsh journals online, and Google Books, reveal very few examples. There is an alternative in Pregethreg, preacheress, which is slightly more common, but we're still talking about just a handful of examples. And that mirrors the situation in 19th century Wales. With the founding of the Calvinistic Methodist Church in 1811, Methodist ministers could be ordained for the first time. Some of the more informal influence that women could gain in the 18th century was rather more difficult to obtain within the confines of a formal denomination, in which all leadership roles were given to men. Women did crop up as Sunday school teachers, as teaching was always the profession which seemed to be more accessible to women, dealing as it did with young children. There were also positions that did not quite reach the level of the ordained clergy, which might increasingly be filled with women, with the Forward movement emerging as an evangelical force within Wales and using women as speakers, missionaries, and organisers. There are indications that some opportunities arose for women as the Methodist faith was exported overseas, and several women acted as missionaries in the Welsh Calvinistic Methodist missionary schemes in India. A search of the Calvinistic Methodist archive in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth reveals material on some of the women missionaries and on the Reverend Pamela Turner, who was the first woman to be ordained by the denomination in 1978. Otherwise, only one woman appears prominently in the archive: Sarah Jane Rees, known as Cranogwen, after her birthplace in Llangrannog. I think we might have a map. We have. There we go. You'll see on this map that Llangrannog is just around 6 miles away from Blaenporth. So that area of South Cardiganshire did seem to produce some remarkable women. And the word Pregethreg was used more often about her in the 19th century than for any other woman. She was quite exceptional. There she is. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography describes her as a sailor, schoolmistress, and poet. In the Dictionary of Welsh Biography, she is a schoolmistress, poet, editor, and temperance advocate. Both go on to mention lecturer and preacher, but only as additional activities. But she was a pioneer in many different areas. She came from an area with a very strong seafaring tradition, and she was the daughter of a sea captain. Rejecting her parents' wish that she be apprenticed as a dressmaker, she instead sailed with her father for 2 years and gained her master's certificate from a nautical school in London by the time she was 21. I think that's quite remarkable. She then returned to teach in her own old school, including giving lessons in navigation to boys. At the age of 26, she entered a poem in the National Eisteddfod and won first prize. For the first time that a woman ever achieved this. And she beat some of the most celebrated poets of the age. She became a famous lecturer, touring America. And she became the first female editor of a Welsh journal, Frydones, or the British Woman, which was one of the first intended primarily for women. An interest in temperance grew. It came from her commitment to her religious faith, and she founded the South Wales Women's Temperance Union in 1901. In addition, she became the first established woman preacher in Wales. Now, there was considerable opposition to the idea of a woman preaching from a pulpit, but she continued to argue that she had a calling which could not be denied. That even she went through periods of self-doubt as a result of the questions raised about her call to preach. And as we've seen, that sense of uncertainty was something expressed by all of those pioneer women. Elizabeth Thomas and Jane Owens were largely forgotten by Methodist historians, and one has to dig deep to locate them. Cranogwen seemed like the major pioneer in her day because nobody knew anything of her predecessors. The major difference, however, was that Cranogwen was able to preach in public, not just in private societies, and she proved a very popular lecturer and preacher. Her notebooks give an indication of the content of her sermons and her lectures, and it is possible to see why she was successful, as there is a structure and clarity along with a vibrancy to what she was planning to say. By the end of the 19th century, in Welsh Methodism, a select group of women had become famous in Methodist circles. But it was only by the end of the 19th century that any of them came to be acknowledged and acclaimed by the denomination. Although Cranogwen remained somewhat controversial, she had forged a path which other women were following, including Rosina Davies among the Congregationalists. It was inevitably easier for those who followed. But the great female icons of Welsh Methodism by the end of the 19th century were not preachers, but Anne Griffiths and Mary Jones. Both were born in the late 18th century. They had both taken active steps to seek out or express their faith, but both could be acclaimed as modest and unassuming. The story, of course, of 15-year-old Mary is still cited as an inspiration by the Bible Society. She walked barefoot 26 miles from her home in order to reach Bala, where she hoped to buy a Bible from Thomas Charles, the great Methodist leader who had a stock of the 1799 SPCK Bible. She came from a poor family, but she'd learnt to read in Sunday school, and she'd saved up for weeks in order to be able to afford the Bible. She was held up as a great moral example. Now, the picture you can see on the slide is of her in old age, and is an accurate representation, but she's usually depicted imaginatively as the young, barefoot girl who walked in search of a Bible. Now, the other acclaimed figure was Anne Griffiths, who's regarded as one of the greatest Welsh hymn writers of the 18th century. But it was only years after her death, that she came to fame. And here, the picture on the slide is the carving on her memorial chapel, based on a written description of her appearance, because there isn't any portrait of her. Her hymns weren't published in her lifetime. And indeed, they weren't even written down until the family's maidservant, Ruth, who had confined them to memory, dictated them to her husband, and he wrote them down. As was often the case with female writers in the early 19th century, Anne's work was at first published without her gender being disclosed. Both women had a strong association with Thomas Charles, who had provided Mary with her Bible, and who gave spiritual advice and encouragement to Anne. It was, as it was very often the case, that it was through a personal link with some of the prominent men of the movement that women gained some sort of status and opportunity. Methodism did not hold doors wide open for Methodist Welsh women, but it did give them some limited opportunities to express themselves, sometimes in verse, sometimes through the spoken word. These were opportunities which were only very gradually pushed further towards full-blown preaching. Even with an extraordinary call, it proved very difficult for a woman to be able to state with confidence, Pregethreg wy fi, I am a preacher.